So welcome everyone to today's faculty-led workshop with, I always say SOLA, Adesope, and on mind mapping. And this is a collaboration between the Global Campus, the Provost's Office, and the Teaching Academy. So Vice Provost of Academic Affairs, Erica Austin, is here to speak a little bit and introduce SOLA.
Thank you, Rebecca. Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. And thanks to Global Campus and the Teaching Academy for putting together this series of faculty-led workshops. They've really been terrific, and I think a lot of people have gotten a lot out of them. And we really appreciate that SOLA Adesope is here today to visit with us about concept mapping. And for those of you who don't already know, maybe you do know and you've forgotten, at the beginning of this academic year, we gave every entering freshman on all of our campuses a copy of this book, The A Game, which has 9 steps to better grades. And it just happens that one of the 9 steps to better grades is about setting learning objectives. And one of the strategies featured in that chapter is concept mapping, featuring our own SOLA Adesope. And so there was a lot of interest on campus, hopefully among students, but we know among instructors, in the use of concept mapping to promote student engagement and student learning and student success. And SOLA has very kindly offered to give us a bit of some tips on how we might be able to use that in our classes. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the book, I brought several of them here. If you're in Pullman, you can take a look. I can also tell you that we just put 15 copies of this book on reserve at Holland Library under the class title of Cougar Success. So students can check out these books, I think at any campus. We have them on reserve. Several instructors for different classes have put them on reserve already at Holland Library, at the Science Library in Pullman, and I believe they're also on reserve at Tri-Cities and Vancouver, but we can check on that, and if they aren't, and you're at those campuses and you'd like to put them on reserve under Cougar Success, we have a few more copies. So we'd be happy to make them available for that. So with all of that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Adesope, and we can learn about concept mapping.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Dr. Austin. Do I need this? Maybe now.
Before we do have attendees that we're streaming to, and so if you have a question, you need to speak into the mic so that they can hear you, not so that we can hear you.
Thank you so very much, everyone, for coming. I think this is quite an honor for me to be able to come here today and share some of the work that we have done over the last 10 years. Special thanks especially to Dr. Erica Austin and to Rebecca, Susan, and everyone who have worked, you've all worked, many of you have worked with me to put this together, so I just want to say thank you. I'll just go through this. Sorry, my laser pointer isn't working. But just to give you an overview of what I'll be talking about today, I'll just give you an overview of my research and teaching interest, and then talk more specifically about what concept maps are. I'll give you highlights of my research program in concept mapping for teaching and learning, which actually started with a meta-analysis of concept maps, which Ken Sufka in his A+ book, heavily cited. Actually, Ken has invited me to collaborate with him on some projects now. Then I'll talk about strategies for using concept maps in the classroom, then share a few software tools that could support concept mapping. And then I'm hoping that we will engage in some activities that will help us reify some of the concepts that I'll be talking about today. And if you can't hear me, please just, I do have a big voice, so just let me know if you can't hear. I am from the educational psychology program here on campus. This discipline called educational psychology is so fascinating, and I can, begin to tell you more about it if you're interested later. But I had my first degree in computing science, my master's degree in educational technology, and then my PhD in educational psychology, with some other work experiences that have shaped my interest over the years. I do research and I teach how to empower students to self-regulate their own learning. It's such a powerful psychological phenomenon that we need to put students at the forefront of their own learning enterprise. I do research and I teach in STEM education, science, technology, engineering, math, education. Because of my technological background, I do research in multimedia learning and adaptive systems and how those systems can be used to improve teaching and learning. I do research. My really big major area of research is in methods, different methods for doing research, especially one method called meta-analysis. But today I would like to speak with you more specifically about knowledge representation, concept mapping. For many decades and centuries, we've always used text for learning. Text is the dominant form of teaching and learning. And about 15 years ago, even much longer than then, many researchers have started looking into the use of other available formats for learning. But about 15 years ago, more specifically, I started looking more into how do we better represent knowledge apart from text. And that brought me into the use of this tool called concept maps. So this is the overview of my talk or workshop today. Describe concept mapping again and then run through some of those topics that I actually talked about before. Concept map is a strategy for organizing and representing information. It's a well-known educational strategy, and a true concept map needs to include what we call concepts. Those concepts are also called nodes. They are usually enclosed in circles or boxes. And then they also need to have what we call relationships among concepts. And those relationships are usually depicted as labeled links, illustrated by lines and arrows connecting concepts together. I do want to say that some people have different ways of representing knowledge. There are some people who would have only concepts with no relationships or labels. There are some of us who have taken a very rigorous stance that is not concept mapping. A concept map really should have not just only concepts, but relationships between concepts, because that is the way that knowledge is stored in a long-term memory. My name is Sola. I work at Washington State University. I work here. If you see two notes, Sola WSU, without anything connecting them together, then it's just fragmented pieces of knowledge. I mean, it's not something that is holistic. So we have defined concept maps more like propositions, something that can form a complete proposition. Sola works at WSU. Then that will make a whole sense. There are many variations of concept maps. Some people call them knowledge maps. Folks in computing science will call them semantic networks, things like ontologies for representing a domain of knowledge. People in mathematics who are very familiar with graph theory, directed and indirected graphs or undirected graphs, it's also a form of concept map. Many teachers do call them topic maps, just to organize the topics that they want to talk about. I want to give you an example of concept map here. That's a node, and that node could be anything. Could be President Floyd, or could be Dr. Elson Floyd is a president at WSU. So that's a node there. But again, that in and of itself does not constitute a concept map. If you have other nodes, because again, that's the nature of knowledge, things are always related. So that big node is related to these two smaller nodes. How? You define such relationships with the link, labels, and an arrow. Directionality of relationship is also very, very important because we need to know what directions, and that's usually depicted using arrows. Then those, each of these smaller nodes could actually also be related with other things, and it could go on and on like that. So you have that one small arrow by your left related to three other things, and then there are also, those relationships are shown with link labels, and then the other node is also related, and that relationship is depicted using those labels. You may have different types of concept maps. A concept map can take many forms, provided it includes concepts and relationships. So you could have what we call like a spider web or spider kind of information where you organize information outward around a central topic. So this could be a central topic, say human nervous system, or global climate change or anything, and then you have nodes that are related directly to global climate change, and then those relationships are also in some forms or shape related with other things. So those other relationships can also emerge from the other relationship that you have there. You could also have hierarchical maps. Actually, Joseph Novak, who invented concept maps in science education, he has this hard stance that knowledge should be hierarchically organized. I take a different position that it could also be radial or spider-like. But then some people do depict knowledge in a hierarchical structure, from most to least important, or from most inclusive and general to very less inclusive and more detailed, nuanced, and specific kind of information. Let's do something here. Would you be able to arrange the following three terms and connect them with arrows using these link labels: caused by, treated with, and kill? Bacteria, pneumonia, and antibiotics. Let's take a minute or two to get that done. You do have some sheets. If you need sheets of paper or pencils, please do let me know. Well, you've been so protective of me. That's okay, let's have fun. Learning is at its very best when it's playful and at the same time serious. So, all right, who would like to share? Yes. Would anyone like to share what you have there? Okay, yes. Well, here's the mic. I can pass. Thanks, Rebecca. Thank you. Who would like to share? I do see some hands here. All right, thanks, Susan.
So I put sort of pneumonia at the top,
Okay.
if I can say that.
So you're having like a hierarchical type of map?
Well, it doesn't really turn out that way.
Okay.
It's just here. So,
All right.
so pneumonia is here.
Okay.
And then to the left of that, I put caused by, bacteria
Yes.
with an arrow that points from bacteria to pneumonia.
Okay.
And then I put treated with antibiotics on
Okay.
the right-hand side
Okay.
with an arrow from pneumonia to the antibiotics. And now I'm not sure if it should be the other way or which way. And then kill is out here in a little node all of its own with an arrow from antibiotics into kill and then from kill to bacteria.
That's interesting. Anyone has something different? Thanks, Susan. Yes.
Mine is much like Susan's, but I added a concept because I thought pneumonia can either be bacterial or viral. So I split it out, and then the antibiotics would just be related to the bacterial.
Thank you.
But I don't know which way the arrows go.
That's really good. So you can see what may be going on in the cognitive process there that more, unlike text, which many people process at a very surface level, when you ask your students to construct concept maps, it takes them suddenly to a much higher level of cognitive processing. They just have to understand relationship among concepts, which many students are not trained to do today. Many students process things at a superficial level. So this is one reason why concept maps are very powerful for learning. And again, we have, in our theoretical work, we have proposed like 7 reasons why concept maps are effective for learning. And one of it is that it closely mirrors or aligns with the way information is stored in a long-term memory, in that, network-like, schema-like type of fashion. So when students process information or take in information the same way that that information will be stored in a long-term memory, such congruency can lead to better recall and transfer of information. And it's like you are gently, slowly pushing your students to think more. What is the relationship between concepts? So thank you so much. This is what I have here. Okay, I hope. Okay. So I have pneumonia caused by bacteria, treated with antibiotics, and then that will kill bacteria. So that could be one form. But you can also change things around. This is the beauty of concept maps. So you can have antibiotics kill bacteria, and bacteria can cause pneumonia, and then antibiotics treatment for pneumonia. And then you can also change it around here by having bacteria can cause pneumonia killed by. Now it's not killed by antibiotics and then treatment for pneumonia. So things can, be manipulated as students see fit. So let me briefly talk about, just really give you highlights of what we have done. I think my journey with concept mapping started about 15 years ago when I was in graduate school. I started working on that project 14 years ago. And didn't actually know how this will pan out on the long run. I was working with my advisor, going to campus every Saturday. Those who are familiar with doing meta-analysis here would know it's a ton of work. I mean, looking at thousands of studies within a particular domain. But I didn't quite know. But after the project was completed, I think it was done for almost 2 or 3 years. We submitted the paper to the Review of Educational Research, which is currently like #1 journal in the field of education out of like 219 educational journals with an impact factor of about 5.0. So it was accepted. In fact, it came back with very minimal revisions, but it began a journey that even while in grad school, getting a paper in the Review of Educational Research, I wasn't quite sure what that meant. But when I was checking this few hours ago, that paper had been cited 436 times by other researchers. In fact, mostly researchers outside of education, in visualization, in computing science, nursing, and different fields. So it's one of the most frequently read articles in the Review of Educational Research, and it set the stage for a program of research on visual displays for me, especially with concept mapping. And I have since taken that very pragmatic approach in training graduate students too. I make them do a meta-analysis first in the area of work that they are interested in. Then they are able to see the big picture. This is what has been done in the field. This is what has not been done, and this is why those things have not been done. And this is the next logical step to take in the field. Many of my students have enjoyed that process, and we do have a full-fledged meta-analysis course in the College of Education now, if some of you would like to send your graduate students there. So talking about, I'll just give you about a few slides about that meta-analysis. I think I'm passing the paper around about 36 pages, journal article. But here is a good question. Do researchers care about concept maps? As you can see from this graph, concept mapping started 1980, 1981, actually 1970, 71. I think there was just one study in 70, 71, maybe one or two up to 75. And then in the 80s, the volume of research in that field picked up significantly. So as you can see from 1980 here, there's such a spike or jump in the volume of research that has been done with concept maps. So again, do students like concept maps? We reviewed many studies that show that students actually like concept maps, especially bilingual students or students who are studying another language with concept maps. So studying bilingual maps when compared with list, many students in this particular study said it's easier for learning. Those are effect sizes with an effect size of 0.48, which is a moderate effect size. Satisfaction with presentation format, another moderate effect size there. Motivation and concentration, small but reasonable effect size. And confidence in future performance, another moderate effect size. Reynolds and Dancero also studied what they call the hypermap and compared that with hypertext on satisfaction construct. That's a pretty large effect size, close to 0.9. And frustration and confusion, you reverse the scale, that was 0.80. It's so simple. The syntax of concept map, especially for ESL students or ELS students, it's really very simple syntactic structure. Node, label, or link, node. So if they can map that proposition, then it's not surprising that they're saying that it's simple. Concept maps effective for learning, as you can see from the distribution of studies in our review here. Concept maps are really, really effective for learning, with the majority of the studies falling along that 0.5 effect size. Then we compared the use of concept maps in different countries in US and Canada when concept maps were constructed. There are different levels of cognitive processing or processes that go on with construction of concept map and giving students a pre-constructed concept maps to study with. But we did find that whether you ask them to study your own concept map or you ask them to construct their own concept maps, students actually learn much better than the conventional text that we use. In US and Canada, across 18 studies with over 1,500 students, we had an effect size of 0.48. And these are weighted effect sizes, and I can talk more about that. In Africa, 1.45. This is really huge, and I was privileged to actually meet the Secretary of Education for Nigeria, the Assistant Secretary of Education for Nigeria, Peter Okebukola, who was involved in some of these studies in Africa. And the rationale for this huge effect size, like 1.5 standard deviation, was that the conventional way of teaching in Africa is through intensive lecturing. So when these students were exposed to more constructive process of learning, they saw quite a jump in the way they learn. In Taiwan, surprisingly, well, but again, with caution, just 2 studies, it did not show any effect. So we call for more studies in Asia, especially in Taiwan. When maths were studied, US and Canada, across 37 studies with close to 3,400 students, we had an effect size of 0.37. So, you know, in all contexts, I wouldn't be able to show you domain knowledge and different grade levels, including post-secondary education. We found concept maps to be very powerful for learning. So how do we interpret that meta-analysis? Maps were more effective for students with lower verbal ability, especially ESL students. They are more effective for retaining central ideas than detail level kind of ideas. What are the major concepts? When students read a whole textbook and you ask them to construct a simple 1-page concept map, then they are challenged to really process the content of that textbook at a much higher level of cognitive processing. So concept maps are generally more effective for learning than text and outlines. But here was what we found. The downside of maps: when students have to construct concept maps, they need practice to benefit from mapping. Many students don't know how to, because again, it's different from conventional text. A fairly complex concept map will require software to do, and the biggest problem we found was the complexity in reading concept maps. If you, as an instructor, you know, just constructed what we call advanced organizer, or give your students to read a fairly complex map, students may be wondering, how do I start processing this map? Where do I start? Unlike text that is conventionally processed left to right, top to bottom, you can process concept maps in any order. So students might be lost in navigating the topology of this map. So that was one big problem. In my, so after we published that, in my later work, what we have done was to develop software that integrates concept mapping with document annotation for learning. It's called GStudy. Still evolving. And then we did a series of studies on what we call animated concept maps to reduce that map shock and then decrease cognitive load. Again, animated concept map is like, you can give, ask your students to construct a concept map, and that it could still be fairly difficult for you to score too, because, you know, it's all fairly complex. But here is it. You can ask your student to do animated map where they do audio narration, and then you are involved in, you know, the step-by-step development of that map. So, you know, they say a concept, it pops up on the screen, and then it's connected by or consists of, so you can see how students are actually thinking through the topic. So we've conducted many studies, as I said. We proposed animated concept map. We've published 6 studies on the effects of concept maps and over 10 conference presentations on different experiments, and do have 2 studies under preparation. Different strategies for concept mapping. You can ask students to fill in the blanks in pre-constructed map from a list of concepts, especially when students are starting to be exposed to this strategy. It could be daunting. And again, especially for you as an instructor, you just don't want students to be headed in different directions. If there are certain objectives of the lesson that you want to teach, you can have a list of major concepts. They could be 20, they could be 30, they could be 50, they could be 100, they could be as few as 5. And then also, you may want to also give them, you know, connecting words or labels, or you may not. And then you ask them to consolidate the understanding of concepts and relationships using those prescribed lists. So as you can see here, so those are, you know, what I would call partially completed maps. And then they can do partial filling maps, which is 1. and then you have the, even multiple choice questions to go with it. They can do fill-in propositions or, labels. You have the notes, and then you want them to see the relationship between the notes. You can do, again, pre-selected term mapping, just as I said before. You give them all the terms, and then you ask them to use the following concepts. And you can ask them to use all the concepts and show how they're related. You can also do micro mapping, where you provide students with a list of starter or seed terms, about 5 or 6 of them, and ask students to use those terms in developing their map, and another 5 to 6 terms from their own knowledge of the topic. So you can see how they use your own terms and then develop more terms. You can develop an expert map of a course topic and provide that to students as what we call advanced organizers prior to teaching and for review purposes. And in fact, you can present that the first day you're starting to talk about the topic. This is the structure of knowledge that I would expect everyone to have at the end of this topic on global climate change, at the end of this topic on, whatever the topic may be. And then after discussing the topic or going through the topic, which could be in a week or 2 or 3, you can represent that map again and let students see where they are in terms of the knowledge there. So this will be, what we call advanced organizers. That's a concept map on climate change that we used with Biology 106 students on this campus. I think about 500 students there, talking about global climate change and some of the effects of climate change. You can also have unguided maps. Once students are familiar with concept mapping processes, they can also be asked to do unguided maps, like after reading a section of text, just ask them to map it out. At the end of a topic or at the end of the course. This process helps with identifying and tying together core concepts and may also act as a learning tool for test revision. That was what Ken Sufka was talking about in his A+ book. It's incredibly powerful because you're able to see how students develop knowledge. Many different software tools for concept mapping. Kids can also be engaged in it. I mean, you can download what is called Kidspiration, and I think there are free, shareware on the net. You can do inspiration, Matchware, OpenMind. Microsoft VCO can also do concept mapping, Smart Draw. And I think everyone should be able to get a copy of these PowerPoint slides. And then this is the one that I really like, CMAP tools. These guys from Florida, they initially, I think, got about $3 million. They were funded by the U.S. Navy, or maybe U.S. Navy or U.S. Army, to develop tools that will help Navy personnel to learn how things are related. So they got that tool, and since then they've got millions of dollars to develop that tool. Being a publicly funded project, they have made available the software. It's called CMAP Tools. If you just Google CMAP Tools, a free online tool built for, you can do collaborative concept mapping. Someone can be here, another person can be on the Vancouver campus, in Spokane campus, and then they can work concurrently together on a concept map and share a concept map. So they can also attach videos. That's something that I also need to say. You can ask your students to attach videos as notes or even attach images. They can attach files, links, and other external resources. So if we click on CMAP tools, let's see what we have here. Okay, I think I'm supposed to drag this. Sorry, okay. I'm supposed to drag this here. Well, it's www.ihmc.us. That's the link. Sorry, I'm trying to move this so you folks can see it. Huh. Wow, it's not working. Okay. Oh, okay. Well, let's just. So this is the tool I wanted to. So if you click on that link on the PowerPoint slide, it will take you to the download page, and it's free. Just put in your name, first name, last name, institutional affiliation, and so on and so forth. And this is the tool, and then it will download, and then you can install the software. So file, edit, format, collaborate, tools, window, and help. So if you were going to create a node, you can very easily double click. Let me see here. I hope this seems to be hanging. Sorry, I can't find. Well, once you double click, sorry, I can't see this on my screen. We were having, okay. So if you double click here, I think it did that, but okay, new concept. And then you can see human nervous system. Oh, well, the problem is that I can't see this on my screen. Okay, so human nervous system. And then you can go to another place and double click to, you can have the central nervous system, peripheral nervous system, and then if you need to have the link, you can come here and then just take that, and then you can put the labels there. Consists of. So it's really very simple to use, and folks can also collaborate because of our time. I mean, I'm willing to show people. All right. So let's, we don't have a lot of time left. So these are the stages in the construction of a concept map. You can brainstorm, they can organize the ideas, lay the ideas out, think about how things are related with linking, revise, and then finalize. So let's quickly do this. Using the following concepts and labels, draw a concept map of the human nervous system. So these are the concepts. I know this is quite a lot, but it's not as complex as it seems. And then those are the labels. Consist of, ways, includes, controls, and then such as. Let's go. I know I'm putting you to work now. Central nervous system, somatic nervous system, 100 billion neurons. And folks can actually work together. Yeah, I think that might be a good idea, especially if you're not in the sciences or not too familiar with the topic. Yeah. Yeah, folks can work together. Yep, still have 10 minutes here. So, Okay. Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Susan. So think about the level of discussion that is going on.
I think we don't know enough about physiology.
Yeah, you're right, Rebecca. And that was why I said folks can work together. So that's very true. Students need to have a fair amount of knowledge in a domain to be able to, do this. And the next one should be fairly simple. Yeah. So what this can actually do is, especially when you do group work and you need to put someone who knows about something and then someone who is not quite knowledgeable about that topic, this could be a good thing to do because it gets them talking about how things are related. And I know this might be a tough one, especially for those who are not familiar with physiology. But again, it's simple. Human nervous system consists of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system consists of the brain, and the brain consists of 100 billion neurons. And the brain weighs 3 pounds, especially for adults, about 3 pounds. And the CNS, central nervous system, consists of the spinal cord, and so on and so forth. Peripheral nervous system consists of the somatic nervous system, which controls the voluntary movements such as hand waving. And then PNS consists of the autonomic nervous system, which controls involuntary actions such as heartbeat. And the autonomic nervous system consists of the sympathetic system and the parasympathetic system. Well, it could take a whole 2 weeks to learn that, but in just a short summary format, students can have this integrated knowledge of a particular domain and how functions fit together. But this will be easier, I hope. And I do this my first day of any class. I ask my students to tell me why they are unique from every other person in the class, and I hear some funny stories about that. I know why I'm unique here. I don't think there's anyone here who was born in Africa or who had lived in Madison, Wisconsin before, and then moved to Canada, and then moved to Pullman. So I'm unique. So if you can put together in 2 minutes a concept map describing you, and this could be a good way to start learning about concept map. You can ask your student, especially once you introduce them to the process of constructing map, you can ask them to draw a concept map about themselves. And then you're able to, view that and learn a little bit more about your students. I'm not going to take that from, I won't collect that or go around. So I know it's 5 minutes to 1. So what we will do now is to just take questions.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
This procedure looks very structured, and it seems to me that the individuals that participate in this have to have a certain level of understanding and knowledge before they begin the process.
Exactly.
And so how do you prepare your students to actually begin this process with a realm of information, a realm of learning that they're going to conduct or they're going to achieve in the class? Somewhere they have to have a background, they have to have a level of knowledge to start making the connections,
Yeah.
to identify nodes and relationships and those kind of things.
Yeah.
How do you prepare your students to begin this process?
Thank you so much. That's a really great question. In some of those slides, I talked about different strategies. One of those strategies, one or more of those strategies could actually be very useful, like giving students pre-constructed maps. I mean, this is the structure of knowledge these are the objectives, these are the main, in fact, in what is called the Next Generation Science Standards K through 12, they now call it the big ideas. These are the big ideas, the major concepts that we're going to touch on with this topic, and then give that to your students so that they can see how those different pieces fit together. That's from your own perspective. Then as we talk about each concept or each subtopic, students can begin to develop concept maps increasingly, gradually. So it's not like, once they talk about the central nervous system in week 1, they can have, 5, 10 different concepts and talk about how those pieces fit together. Week 2, they can talk about peripheral nervous system and then continue to build that concept map throughout the entire semester. So that could be one strategy, but if you have other strategies I would like to learn. Yeah, but you're right. Students need to have a decent amount of knowledge before we can ask them to, put like the previous task or activity that I gave you. That one will be suitable towards the end of semester, when you've covered all those topics, when you've discussed all those topics, and then you want to see what students have retained during the course of the semester. So it's a great question. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
I didn't know the relationships between most of those things, but it struck me as something that would be a great research tool or like a guide for going through the chapter, because instead of just memorizing those things, you're having to figure out how they go together as you're learning them.
Exactly.
So
thank you.
that would be very helpful, I think.
Thank you. In fact, those relationships, that's where the power of concept map lies. Because again, in a long-term memory, if I store a piece of information there, one concept can trigger another. So knowing how concepts are related, I think it's a powerful idea. So thank you for that. It's 1 o'clock.
So it looks like we're basically out of time based
Yeah.
on the people who are getting up
sorry.
and leaving the room.
Yeah.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Sola.
you.
This has been
Thank you
great.
so-
Can we give him a hand?
Thank you so much, Rebecca.
And his contact information. I'd also like to take a minute to thank the Global Campus staff who make this happen, Susan Fine and Darren DeRosier, e-learning consultants, James Cathy, and our videographers, and Richard Miller, our press agent. So we have 3 more scheduled for spring. Academic Integrity, March 5th.
Wow.
First Generation Learners is March 24th, and Understanding Course Evaluations and Using Your Course Evaluations, which will be delivered by the Office of Assessment, and that is in April. So be watching for those coming up. And we will send out the PowerPoint to everybody. And if you have ideas or suggestions for what you think would make a good faculty-led workshop, or a faculty member who would like to lead a workshop, please let me know, Rebecca Vandevoort, bvandevoort at wsu.edu. Great.
Thank you for
coming.
coming.
Sola.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Rebecca.